Hey guys, and welcome to Graphic Designer Pro. In this video, we'll run through the basics of the most common file types and where to use them as a graphic designer. We'll also show you some useful export features within Adobe Illustrator so you can easily create the right files for your projects. So download the free template file for this lesson from the description below, and I'll pass you over to Rory, who will take you through this topic.
Thanks, Ross. So before we jump into each of the file types, we're going to briefly explain the difference between raster and vector files. Vector files are made up of mathematical points, like we create and edit in the likes of Adobe Illustrator. This means that they can be scaled infinitely without a loss in quality or a change in the file size. This is why we create logos, icons, typography, and even illustrations in vector format. Raster files, on the other hand, are made up of a pixel grid, with each pixel containing a colour. The number of pixels making up an image directly impacts on the file size. Unlike vector graphics, if a raster image is scaled beyond its originally defined size, it will lead to a loss in quality and pixelation. They are, however, more suited to detailed images like photographs, as well as web-based graphics, due to the wide compatibility of certain raster file types. So, that being said, let's jump into the files themselves. First on the list is probably the most common file type in the world, JPEG. So firstly, JPEGs are raster files. Where they're strong is in their relatively small file size, their wide range of supported colours, their vast compatibility, and the fact that they can support both RGB and CMYK colour spaces. On the other hand, they are what's known as a lossy file, which basically means they will slightly compress each time they're exported to reduce file size, but at the expense of image quality. They also don't support a transparent background, meaning any transparency will be replaced with solid white. So that being said, they should be used for any photography, detailed images, and web graphics. Moving on, PNG is our next file, and it shares a lot of similarities with JPEGs. Again, this is a raster file type. They support an even wider range of colours, and unlike JPEGs, they also support transparency. PNGs were also created specifically for the web, and they're what's known as a lossless file, which means they retain all data from the original file when exported, so don't lose any image quality. That being said, they only support RGB colours, so aren't really any good for print. And because they are lossless, file size tends to be higher than that of a JPEG. So, use PNGs for web-based images and graphics, especially where transparency is needed and file size isn't as big of an issue. Tiff is our next raster-based file type. This one is less commonly used but does have its place in graphic design. Tiffs support RGB and CMYK colour spaces and can also be lossy or lossless. Their real party piece though is that they support layers, unlike JPEGs or PNGs. This is ideal for continuous editing in the likes of Adobe Photoshop, which allows for far more control than having to edit a flattened image from scratch. The catch though is that the file size of Tiffs can be astronomical. They aren't nearly as compatible as the likes of JPEGs or PNGs either. We would recommend using Tiffs in print work where transparency and layers come into play. Moving on to vector-based files, our first one is PDF. Now this is another hugely common file type, and for good reason. PDFs technically support vector and raster graphics within the same file. In fact, they're great for placing a range of other file types into for use in various situations. They can also be multi-page documents, which is ideal for things like presentations, magazines, or brochures, for example. The PDF file format is also a standard for most printers and is hugely compatible. That being said, PDFs are mainly geared towards print output or more complex multi-page presentations as opposed to singular images or graphics. SVG is our next file type, and this is an increasingly popular option for web design. This is because they can be used in conjunction with CSS, which for those of you that aren't familiar means the vector parameters can be changed with code for greater control and even animation on a web page. With that though, it's worth mentioning that SVGs are really only good for web use, so use them for vector web graphics that need more precise control and animation applied to them. Last but not least, EPS is our final file type that we'll look at in this video. Now EPS is another vector-based file type that can also support raster graphics within it. Just remember that just just because a raster image is placed within a vector file does not give it vector capabilities in terms of scalability and file size. EPS files can support RGB and CMYK color spaces, but are more commonly used for print graphics. PDFs and new features like Adobe libraries mean that EPS files are being used less and less, but they can still be called upon for printing your vector designs. So that's it for our brief summary of the most popular file types used in graphic design, excluding software working files, that is. But let's head on to Adobe Illustrator now, where we'll show you how to easily export to each of these formats. So here we are in Adobe Illustrator, and we are using the template file that you can also download from the description below, as Ross mentioned at the start of the video. So we have a few assets set up here, some simple logos and some logo marks on the right hand side, and if I grab my artboard tool, each of these are on their own artboard, which is useful as well when it comes to exporting. But we're also going to show you another really useful feature in Adobe Illustrator called Asset Export. Now we can open our asset export by going up to Window, and you will find it down in the list here. It's in alphabetical order, so I'm just going to click it and we get our asset export panel opening here. And what I can essentially do is drag in any grouped objects within Illustrator. So this could be vector designs, it could be raster images as well, or a combination of both. So I'm going to drag some of these logos into this panel here, and you can see we're getting some small thumbnails created. Just note that these objects do have to be grouped before you put them in here. So if I select all of these icons, for example, and dragged all of them in at once, they're actually going to go in as 4 separate files here. Now from this point, I can click where we have the asset names here and change these, and this essentially relates to the file name that they'll have. But down below here, we also have some export settings. So at the moment, you'll see we have an option that says PNG, so this is the file type that we're going to be exporting to, and on the left hand side we have a scale option. At the moment this is set to 1920p, so that's 1920 pixels wide. If I drop this down though, we get some more options. I can select just 1x, which means it's just going to export at the size it's been set up at, and we have some more options within here. We can define the resolution, width or height, or we have the size presets as well. What's great about this though is that I can actually click this button that says add scale, and we can actually export multiple file types all at once. So you can see here we have JPEG, SVG and PDF as well. Where we have the different numbers next to JPEG, this just denotes the quality setting that we'll be using. So I would always recommend sticking with JPEG 100 for the maximum image quality. We also have a suffix option if you want to add something at the end of the file name. In this case, I'm just going to get rid of that though, and I'm going to add an SVG option and a PDF option to this list as well. So from this point, I can basically select any one of these assets and export them, or I could hold Shift and select all of them, and then just simply click export down at the bottom. I'll create a new folder and just call this asset export, click create and then click choose, and then it's going to automatically export all of those file types. So as you can see, we have our asset export folder here, and if I double click into this and sort this by kind, you can see we have our JPEG files here, as well as our PDFs, PNGs and SVGs. So this is really easy to export multiple files all at once. Now you'll notice the only 2 file types missed off from our list that we've just covered are TIFF and EPS. Now it's more likely that you'd be creating and saving TIFFs from the likes of Adobe Photoshop, but it is still possible in Illustrator. You would simply have to go to File, Export and Export As, and from the format drop down where we also have our standard files like PNG and JPEG, you'll see down here we also have TIFF, and we can also specify to use artboards for this as well. So I'll go ahead and double click into my asset export folder and click export, and you can see we have the option to specify the color mode here, so we can switch to RGB or grayscale, and we can also select the resolution. So I'm just going to go ahead and click OK and let those files export, and you'll see down at the bottom of our folder we have our TIFF files. However, you will notice that the file size is absolutely massive. intuitive. Last but not least though, we can also export EPS files individually, but to do that we need to go up to File and Save As this time. And where we have the Adobe Illustrator file format drop down, I can select EPS from here, and I can specify to use these artboards so that it will export each artboard to a separate EPS file, which is also very useful. I'm also going to just click Range, even though I'm going to export all of these, and that just means it's not going to also create a master EPS file with all of them. I just want each artboard as a separate file and nothing else. So I'm just going to go ahead and click Save to my asset export folder, then OK. And now when I go back into my asset export, you can see it's using the file name of our Illustrator file, and we have EPS files for each of our artboards as well. So it's really easy to export from Adobe Illustrator. It's very quickly to do this to multiple file types, so I'd highly recommend that you get used to these features. And we go into much more detail about each of these file types and more in our course, so be sure to check out our free training where you can get more information on it and sign up if you're interested.
So, as Rory's explained, each file type has its own pros and cons, but you'll hopefully get used to exporting each format depending on the project you're working on. And if you have any questions, then drop a comment down below and we'll do our best to help. And if you want to learn more about graphic design, we've created a free 1-hour training where you'll discover the top 5 secrets of successful designers, which saves you the hassle of having to figure it all out for yourself. We'll be showing you how to immerse yourself in the sector you're designing for, creative thinking and how to spark creativity, what good composition is and how you can achieve it in your designs, how to pick the right colours for your designs, and how to pick the right typefaces for your projects. So if you are serious about leveling up your design skills, then make sure to sign up for the next free webinar. Space is limited and these events always fill up fast because they're significantly better than the information others charge you, and ours is free. The link is in the description. You're not going to want to miss it. I'll see you there.